I think from a public health perspective, we're often used to thinking long-term about the long-term benefits. So some of what we're trying to do is redefine what the return on investment might be, and the return on investment might be our next generation.
One of the challenges we have to overcome in Western society, particularly in the United States, is we all hear almost on a daily basis, figures on car production, housing starts, consumer goods, how many sales were made on Black Friday. We seem to measure our health, in terms of our consumption habits. So how do we start looking at quality of life in other terms than just consumption?
We've come to equate consumption as come to view consumption as the thing that's critical for our economy, and I would argue that it's not so much consumption that's critical for our economy and for our well-being as investment. Investing in our future takes many forms. Part of that, I think, should be investing in means of producing the energy we need that don't contribute to climate change, that are sustainable, that protect our environment. Part of it is ensuring we have good roads and bridges, or buildings that last into the future, basic public infrastructure.
I think it's a multiple-pronged challenge. I think we have to think about changing the technology of making and designing. We have to do the best we can at community education. And we have to work on the public policies. It seems to me that if we had a strategy in every community that was three-pronged and conscious in that sort of goal, that community by community we would be on much more sustainable and a lower carbon footprint for the future.
Yeah, and I'd like to have a public policy approach that actually, instead of having a gross national product that is almost entirely a function of consumption, production and consumption, but actually incorporates these other kinds of considerations in our economy, investment value as well as quality of life issues.
But really, the government's role, public policy role, ought to be about equity. It ought to be about how are we going to share the resources, not just with us here, but everybody that follows us. And so that's that leadership role you're talking about and so maybe that's where the discussion has to be, is government's job is to make things, to create some equity, opportunities for equity, if nothing else.
I would also point out that having a public policy doesn't always mean having regulation. You can also provide that leadership role in moving forward with public-private partnerships, for example, in the arena of conservation of natural resources. Those public-private partnerships can be very meaningful. You can bring a lot of private resources and dollars to the table for people that are interested and have common goals. Part of the role of government and public policy is to point out the interconnectedness of all these things we've been talking about, and to be able to offer that leadership role. And when you think about the example of conservation of natural resources, you could actually take a very incentive-based, non-regulatory approach when you bring some of those partnerships to the table.
I think having a diverse audience is really an important part, and not always thinking about what is the new policy, but what are the old policies that are really the barriers to us being perhaps more prepared. And I really feel like we don't always ask everyone to the table because we think, well, we're the community servants, so we should be able to find this answer. And I think sometimes if we would create a greater opportunity for discourse and then look at what we already have and see how effective that is.
One of the key public policy needs that turns up, I think, that is a barrier to collaboration on these kinds of projects is that no county is required to communicate with or cooperate with the adjacent county for anything. Not planning, not road connections, not infrastructure, and our governmental policy jurisdictions have been set up to be very independent. We have to develop in this state a greater desire and a greater understanding of the value of these resources that you folks have been helping us focus on today. My dream is that we could initiate through this process and others, a statewide conversation on conservation. And that we might ultimately end up with a constitutional revision with a section on conservation. Other states have begun to take this on and are being successful. And it seems to me that every solution that has been talked about in this program is possible. But the first step is understanding desire and ability to lead that effort, that discussion. And if we can foreshorten that understanding desire and ability to lead on conservation, I think all of these suggestions and ideas are possible.
We are caretakers of a land that is rich in resources. If we are good stewards of this land, we will help provide a sustainable future for our next generations. It is a sacred trust that begins with each one of us. It begins with you. How will you participate in this conversation? What is important to you about Nebraska's environmental future?